Okay, I think people are more or less there. So we will begin. So I want to thank you all for joining us for this incredible film screening and for our little question and answer period right afterwards. But I want to begin the event by acknowledging the land from which we're all tuning in. Many of you may be coming from various places along the Connecticut River. From where I live in Conway, but it's called Conway, Massachusetts. I'd like to acknowledge that the land that I'm on is Nipmuc land. And I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki and Pennachucks to the north. I'm Polly Byers, and I'm executive director of the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, which is a small NGO based in Amherst, Massachusetts. And for those of you who don't know, Karuna has been around for a little over 25 years, mostly working on internationally on countries affected by violence, and has worked in over 40 countries using a variety of approaches to support dialogue, foster reconciliation, and build inclusive governance. But in addition to the international work, Karuna has also been involved in promoting dialogue and understanding on key issues here in the US. So today's screening and this question and answer is part of our current series called Erasure and Restoration, which is a lecture, workshop, and dialogue series that explores both the historical and current narratives around local Indigenous presence, as well as the ongoing settler mindset. And it's obviously particularly relevant with this year, 2020, being the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing in 1620 on Wampanoag land. So today we are very particularly excited to be able to share this movie with you and to have both Nitana Hicks Greendeer and Anne Makepeace to think about and talk to us about the film and about how the loss of language fits into the threat of erasure and how its reclamation can bring restoration. And finally, I do want to thank our supporters, which are the Mass Humanities, the Mass Cultural Council, and the Ellis L. Phillips Foundation, without whom we wouldn't be able to do this. So briefly, I just want to quickly introduce our two panelists. Dr. Nitana Hicks Greendeer is a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and has worked for the past 15 years on the Wôpanâak Language Reclamation Project as a teacher, researcher, and curriculum developer, and currently is head of the School for the Wôpanâak Language Immersion School. And she served her tribal community as the director of the education department for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. In addition to that, Dr. Greendeer teaches in the Native American Indigenous Studies program at Brown University, previously as a presidential postdoc and now as an adjunct professor. There's a lot more I could say, but I won't. I'll just go on to Anne Makepeace, who has been making award-winning independent films for years, including this film, We Still Live Here. So for over, I think, 3 decades. And she's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and residencies, the McDowell Colony, Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio, and many others, and has won many, many awards. So I could say more about both of them, but we are very thrilled and appreciate you two giving us the time. So maybe I'm going to start off just to let everybody know, we are going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes. For questions, please use the chat function, and we are going to try to, take your questions as we see them and feed them to Anne and Nitana. So maybe Nitana, if just to start us off, could you introduce us to the Wôpanâak Language Reclamation Project which you're now working on, how the work has expanded and changed since this film it was released in 2011, so maybe a while back. So it'd be great if you could just talk a little bit about that to begin with.
Taptanamo, Nataswis Nitana Explained, Kanuto Mas Masipiat, Kawong Natai Masipiat, Ka Kunipiomu, Wamikino, Wachi Nataki Moan. So I just introduced myself, basically said all the same things that Polly had just said. So I won't go through that, but I thought you might like to hear Wampanoag spoken a little bit. As of the end of filming and the release of the film, what had mostly been happening at that time was mostly community classes. So we had a few teachers, mostly Jessie, but a few other teachers as well, myself, and a few teachers from Martha's Vineyard teaching community classes. So, and that would be most often like a once a week class. Occasionally we would do things like immersion weekends and things like that. But that was about the most that anybody was really getting in terms of being able to spend a lot of time with the language. But in 2010, we got our first Master Apprentice grant. And that was from the Administration for Native Americans. And that allowed us to hire full-time positions for people to learn the language. And so with Jessie as our master speaker and 3 apprentices, and that was me and 2 other women. And that was really the beginning of sort of the phase that we're in now, which was really training teachers who have a level of fluency to be able to hold immersion, both for the community and for students. So since 2010, we've had, I don't know the exact number, I'm sort of doing the math in my head right now, but I want to say probably around 10 apprentices. Some that are still with the program and some that have moved on, some that have come and gone and then come back. But we currently have a staff of about 12, I believe, people who are teaching language, learning and teaching language at the same time. And so some of the things that are happening now, in addition to community classes, which are always ongoing, we have classes that are specifically geared toward elders, and other classes that are mostly for children. So we have now, we're in our 4th year, although we actually don't have any 4th year students at the moment, but our 4th year of teaching Wampanoag language as a world language in the Makepeace High School. So that's very exciting. We are in the middle of developing curriculum to go up through a 5th year class at the moment. And we are also in our 5th year of our immersion school. And so we began that in 2016, housed in another, in a Montessori school local on Cape Cod. And we've since moved out into the Makepeace Wampanoag tribal building. And we have now, so we've grown. So we began with just 10 students who were all preschool age. And our oldest students now are 8. And we have 30 students. And so those students receive immersion. Well, these days it's a little bit weird because we're fully remote right now and have been all this year. But in a typical year, the students receive about 6 hours a day of full Wampanoag language immersion from their teachers using Montessori pedagogy. And it's been really amazing to watch, just like the number of speakers that we have really multiply. And so through those students, we're reaching so many more families. Other adults are joining our community classes that may not have otherwise joined. And it's just really been an amazing period of growth for the program. One other thing that I forgot to mention on the public schools as well, we have some after school programming happening there as well in the middle school. So we have pretty much all of the grades covered with language in some way in the community. Most of our programming, just because of where our offices are located, happens in Makepeace. But again, and I think the film mentions that the programming, the language project serves all of the Wampanoag community. So while physically most of it happens in Makepeace, it serves our entire nation. So anyway, that's a little bit about it. And I just wanted to say hi, Mrs. Reese. I see you.
Wow. Well, that's pretty amazing for not that long a period of time. It's actually pretty astounding. I wanted to ask Anne something, but just there's already been a number of questions, and one that sort of directly relates was whether there are any other languages anywhere in the world that have been recovered in the way Wampanoag has. I mean, it's pretty amazing story. Is it unique as far as you know in terms of how it's been recovered?
I know of a lot of language revitalization programs, and Nitana probably knows of a lot more, but I don't actually know of any that have been recovered after not having been spoken for a century. I don't know. Nitana, do you? I've not heard of any.
I don't know of any others that have had the same level of success that we've had. So I know we're the first to have attempted it from no speakers. In this sort of with, like I said, with this level of success. So I think we've sort of set off a little bit of inspiration through these that don't have current speakers, because I do, as I said, I know of others that are attempting it. What it makes us a little different is that we have so much written record that we've had a lot more, we have a lot more working in our favor, and not a lot of other groups have.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. The great irony, of course, is that the Bible has become the Rosetta Stone for bringing back the language, which is, and not very many indigenous tribes have that, have that kind of resource.
Mm-hmm.
Plus all those other amazing wills and letters and deeds and things like that.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible that it's the Bible. It is, as you said, the Rosetta Stone. And I wanted to ask you just a bit about the making of the film. And to begin with, like, what compelled you? How did you get inspired to make the film? I mean, so that would be interesting to hear. And maybe for both you and Nitana to talk about why it was important for the tribe to share the story of reclaiming the language through the film, and maybe, sort of its relevance today. But it'd be great to hear you guys speak a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I got to know Jessie while I was working on another project, a documentary for WGBH. And that documentary was a completely historical film. It was about King Philip's War, which was a horrendous war that happened in 1675-76 that was just devastating for Native peoples. And so while I was doing research for that, actually it's Berta Welch who said, well, you got to meet Jessie. And this would have been in 2007. And so when I met Jessie, I was completely blown away, first of all, by what she was doing. At that point, it was, kind of as Nitana described, there were some weekly language classes, all for adults as far as I know at the time. But she was, actively involved, as you see in the film, in creating a dictionary and things like that. And just to me, that you could actually attempt to do what she was doing, she and her community members, to bring a language back that hadn't been spoken, was just mind-boggling for me. But there wasn't, as I say, really a place for a contemporary story in the film I was then working on. And then that fell apart for me. The GBH project fell apart for me, which is a long story. And it was at the time quite devastating to me. But then I realized, well, isn't the important story the story of what's going on right now, which is a very positive story. King Philip's War was a disaster, whereas this story, while there is, terrible history behind it, which is what caused the language to go dormant, it's a very, very hopeful story, and a story of Native people taking agency and shaping their futures, reshaping their histories and shaping their futures by bringing back the language. So I proposed the idea of doing a film about the reclamation of the language to Jessie, and also to Linda Coombs, who's in the film, but she's not in the film very much, but she was very important in helping us get it made. She was at that time the head of the Wampanoag Indigenous program at Plymouth Plantation. But at any rate, so I proposed doing this project to Linda and Jessie, And they listened, and they were very, by that time I'd won a lot of trust. I'd spent time with people in the community. And so they were open to it. Of course, they said, you know, we need to get the permission of the whole language program, you know, the whole Wampanoag Language Reclamation Organization. So I guess it was, when would that have been? I don't know. Sometime in, I guess, late summer of 2007, there was a meeting of, I think, 30 or 40 people in the program. It was a big group of people, very kind of intimidating for me, you know, because it was a very sensitive issue. And Nitana can speak more to this, but the policy at the time was that by the language program was not to share the language with any non-Wampanoags, and specifically not to share it in any publication or film that could be sold. First of all, in my understanding, and again, Nitana can certainly clarify this, was that the feeling was the language was like this child coming back, and it needed to be nurtured and cared for before it could be, you know, exposed to the non-native world. And so making the proposal about doing a film was a very, very sensitive issue. And there was a lot of discussion at that meeting, a lot of very passionate discussion, some of it very much against the idea. And some of the reasons for that were the ones I just gave you, but also, you know, people asked, I remember, I think it was Tootie who said, do we really want people to see us struggling to learn our own language? You know, it was very, very sensitive. And then I remember that Jesse's husband, gave this very beautiful, eloquent speech about maybe this is the time and maybe this is the person to trust. And when the meeting ended, there was unanimous support for it. So that's, you know, then of course there was the making of the film. That's a whole other story, but maybe Nitana, you know, would like to, were you at that meeting, Nitana?
I was not. I think I came in to the project after it had already been, you know, underway a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, is that pretty much your understanding of the resistance that there would have been?
Yeah, so that actually is still a rule, that we don't share the language outside of the community. In order to take classes or anything like that, you have to live in the house with someone who is a member of one of the communities that we serve. And we do still occasionally make exceptions to that. You know, by vote of the language committee, which is made up of anyone who's teaching or taking a class at the time. And I think that one of the reasons that film was something that we were all really willing and excited to do is because it although, like, I think perspectives like Tootie, you know, say that, like, we don't want people to see us struggle. I think that that's really real for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I think that what's also really important is to make sure that people from a wider audience, and, you know, in a lot of, like, in many audiences, understand that there is still Wampanoag culture happening just always, and not just in a, you know, not just in performance, not just, you know, at a powwow, not just on Thanksgiving, but there are actually people, like, living this and doing this as, you know, just as they live their life, you know, alongside their job, as their job, whatever. And that, you know, it's not necessarily the image that a lot of people have of Native people in general, but very specifically Wampanoag people, because I think, you know, Native people on the East Coast in particular are very often not seen. So I think that that's, you know, one very strong reason why this project was something that everyone wanted to do.
Yeah.
Just sort of in a way following up on that, because it's implicit, I mean, and you're explicit, but about the process of building the trust and working together to be able to do that. Obviously, it took, as you said, a long time and a lot of careful work to build the trust in it, and in you, Anne, to be able to do this, to make the film. And I wonder, it would be just interesting to hear you say a little bit more, particularly about what you learned in that process that other people might learn about the process of building trust between the tribe and non-native, let's say, students or filmmakers, or, you know, in some kind of parallel situation, of just anything more about that process that other people could learn from.
Well, I think, you know, respect and openness and sensitivity go a long way. You know, you don't just, I mean, I'm not Native. A lot of people think my name is Native. It's not. It's an old WASP Puritan New England name. So just to get that out of the way. But I have made films in a number of Native communities across the United States. And, you know, just, I guess one piece of advice, you don't just waltz into a Native community and assume people want to be filmed. It's a very, you know, as I said earlier, it's a very sensitive thing. So it's very important to spend time, hang out, get to know families. It's important to be introduced by someone who's trusted by the community also. You know, don't just show up, you get introduced by someone. And in the way I was introduced to Jessie, for example. And then just to be sensitive throughout. And you know, it was a struggle I had all the way through. You know, you come into a project with a certain preconceived idea. You can't help it when you have to write proposals. For one thing, you have to write endless fundraising proposals, so you have to describe what you think the film's going to be, so you have to then come up with what you think the film should be, but then you have to be, and this is true of all documentaries, not just with Native people, you have to be open to what happens and let that in, and realize that people are, whether it's Native or non-Native, people are trusting you with their personal stories. They're, you know, if you're any good at making documentaries, you're getting at stuff that's meaningful. And so to have that kind of respect and realize, again, working with Native communities, people don't necessarily want to be filmed. I mean, I think it's, you know, in our broader community where everybody's on Facebook and everything else, you know, sometimes it's taken for granted. Oh, don't you want to be in a film? Well, not necessarily. No. So those are some pieces of advice. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but.
No, that was fine. That was great. I'm just going to start. We have a number of questions and lots of compliments coming in on the chat. I don't know if you guys are able to look at that, but here's one that I think would be interesting to hear you speak to. The question says, as someone in the Hispanic community, I'm not fluent in my native language. How important do you think knowing one's native language is in embracing their culture?
Well, I think that, at least for me, I didn't have, I started learning Wampanoag language when I was like, right after I graduated from college. And there are many people in this community who still have never come to class or have maybe, you know, learned in some way, whether it was through coming to a class or a group meeting or some other thing, you know, how to introduce themselves or how to say thank you or how to say hello or, you know, maybe just little bits and pieces. And I don't think, in fact, I know that many of those people would not say that they are any less Wampanoag than someone who does speak their language. And I think it's also really important to note that just because you might not be able to translate a word, right, or to be able to use your language on command, doesn't mean that you don't know it. It doesn't mean that it's not like in you, sort of. And I guess an example of this, and I don't know if this will make sense, but one thing that I realized when learning, I think this is sort of early on actually, so my dad has hunting dogs. He's had hunting dogs my whole life, and I've always noticed that when he calls, or when he's telling his dogs to be quiet if they're barking or something, that he'll tell them to keep still. And I always just sort of thought that was kind of funny because they're barking, they're not running around, right? And as it turns out, in Wampanoag, the word chikwanapish means both keep still and be quiet. So somewhere along the way, when someone went from, maybe the last fluent speaker of Wampanoag, or the very first not fluent speaker, perhaps, took that translation and took the keep still translation and not the be quiet translation, And so while my dad does not speak Wampanoag, I don't know if he could come up with any words. He does know it, and he doesn't realize that he knows it, but it is like in him. And while so like, again, going back to like that culture part of it, like, it may not be, something that he's purposefully doing, but that culture is coming out every time he talks to his dogs, because it's certainly not, like Cape Cod, Massachusetts culture that's telling him to tell his dogs to keep still, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that the movie, it's just so powerfully clear about the importance of language and identity and culture. So, I mean, I think that's just, it comes across so profoundly in the movie. So certainly understand the question. Here's a question. I'm interested that some people have taken names that are tribal and others have kept their seemingly Dutch, Irish, or Anglo names, especially with the language coming back. How is that seen, or what are the thoughts about that question?
I think it really is, it just really, really varies from person to person, I think. My kids all have, American-ish first names. They also have Wampanoag names. Well, not all of them yet, but they will eventually. Whereas other people, like my niece has a Wampanoag word for her middle name, some for the first names. I think it really, I think it's really just a personal choice, and that's just really, for the most part, what it comes down to. And I couldn't even say for sure that it like tends to be these people who will go with, a Wampanoag name and these ones who won't. It really just, I think, as anyone would name their child, what's something that sounds pleasing to the ear, or, maybe after a family member or whatever.
Here's sort of a comment and question. This film and the language reclamation feels like such good medicine. I felt overwhelmed by the soul-crushing notes in the margins of the Wampanoag Bibles. Could you talk more about how this addresses the pain of the genocide?
How the film does, or how these those confessions in the
This is what's the question. I'm assuming. I'm assuming it was felt overwhelmed by these notes, which were obviously were poignant and painful.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure to. But
well, I'll just say when I discovered those, and I can't remember if Jessie told me about them or it was just part of the research, or whether Linda Combs did, but when I read them, they're so poignant because there's so many layers to them. You know, I mean, people were seeing family members die, and the Puritans were telling them it was because they were sinful, you know, and so the pressure to convert to Christianity was just enormous. And it became even more so as the 17th century went on and the balance of power shifted so that instead of being, 100 and then after so many died, 50 starving so-called pilgrims, it became 20,000, within, I don't know, I've forgotten the numbers now, but within 10 or 20 years, there were something like 20,000 English people in the colonies in the North New England, what became the New England states. And the native population had been reduced to about, numbers vary, but as little as 10% by disease. So as that balance of power shifted, it became more and more dangerous to practice your own indigenous religion because it was seen as heathen and had to be rooted out, So when someone says, at first I laughed at praying to God and then my wife died, it's just so heartbreaking. And so to me, those, what are they called? Tears of confession. Is that what they're called? I've forgotten now. Tears of repentance. That's what it is. Tears of repentance. And they're gathered together, and all of those were from Wampanoags on Martha's Vineyard, on Nope, as it was called in the Wampanoag language. I believe in the 1640s, and they were used, as Harvard also used things like this, to raise money for this from the Society of the Gospel for the something or other conversion of the Indians in England. That's how Harvard survived in the 1840s, because they got money from this organization in England. So these Tears of Repentance documents were used to raise money in England for the support of the Puritans and the Puritan religion. So the complexity of those confessions, did they truly in their heart convert? Some did, sure. Anyway, yeah, I'm not being very articulate because I just find them so moving and so heartbreaking.
Oh, they are. Here's a relatively straightforward-ish maybe, but are there any, maybe Nitana, who's been teaching for quite a while, are there any struggles? I mean, I'm sure there are many, but any struggles when teaching the language that you didn't expect?
In teaching?
Mm-hmm, in teaching.
I think for me, I personally find it really hard to not give way too much information. I just find that there are so many like really, really amazingly fascinating things that especially, well, and this is mostly when I'm teaching adults, but I find it really hard not to go off on these like crazy tangents. And, because the language is so entirely unrelated to English, I mean, entirely unrelated. People are, often people really struggle with it. So sometimes when I'm teaching and I'm, like, actually, let's look at this word and let's pull it apart and let's talk about the meaning. And, oh, remember this word over here? Well, it relates to this word. And people are usually just looking at me like really like kind of dumbfounded sometimes. And I'm like, sorry, it's just really cool. But I guess that's another conversation for another day. So that's something that I've personally struggled with just, wanting to share all the things that I've learned over, 17 years now. And some people, on day 2 are really not ready for all of that. So that's one, that's, I guess sort of a day-to-day struggle. I think probably one of the more common struggles that a lot of people face is just people's ability to access and be consistent, so there's like classes tend to run maybe like 8 weeks or 10 weeks or something like that. and then, but a lot of people tend to kind of drop off. And so that's kind of hard, is just kind of getting people to be able to really carve out the time to do this, because lives get busy. We've actually had a lot more success since we've had to be remote, because people can join from home and they can cook dinner while they take class. And so that's actually been sort of an unexpected benefit of this craziness. But I think in general, that's really kind of the struggle, is just, people want to commit, but it's just hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Thanks. Here's another one. In the film, Jessie mentioned that taking the land away from the Wampanoag meant in the language to fall on the ground, because they don't see themselves as separate from the land, being always rooted to the ground. I'm wondering if there are ways that revitalizing and learning the language have altered your understanding of reality. For example, to see ourselves as part of the land is not a modern practice. Were there other ways of seeing, being, and noticing, and knowing that you noticed after speaking and learning the language? So kind of maybe what has changed in terms of perceptions and awareness by learning the language?
I think there's a lot of things like that. Although I don't know necessarily that that the idea of being part of the land isn't something that at least Wampanoag people already feel. So while the language is very explicit about it, it's not necessarily like an aha per se. It's really just more of a confirmation of what we as Wampanoag people already know, I think. Which actually, I guess, is really what I'm thinking. Like, there's a lot of those things that happen in understanding Wampanoag language. From the big things to the small, right? So, a big thing like understanding that we believe ourselves to be physically part of the land, to things like, the thing I mentioned before about, be quiet and be still. And all of these things that just sort of like confirm that the way we act and the way we are and how we do little things and big things are for specific reasons, and for and it's what ties us as Wampanoag people together, and also what makes us separate from other people, or different necessarily, or not necessarily separate. Trying to think of other examples of that, and like I said, I know there's like thousands of them. Every word, I think, probably, or every concept. It's not necessarily the words, maybe, but so here's another one, I guess. So in English, you think about things like feelings, right, as being from the heart. In Wampanoag, almost all the words for feelings, at least all the ones that I can think of right now, have to do with your mind. And it makes sense, because most of the Wampanoag people that I know are very analytical, very rational types, not so much emotional types. And so even though, again, in like mainstream society, we think of anger or happiness as being like more reactive, as opposed to a part of a process of actively choosing how to feel about something. That's the way the language describes these things, as being of the mind that is joyful, or being of the mind that is sad.
That's so interesting to me, because I was remembering on another Zoom something that Jessie told me, obviously years ago. It was in a conversation about how the way that the Wampanoag translators of the Bible translated certain concepts. And the one that really stuck with me was that the way hell was translated was the house of people with empty heads.
Mhm.
So hearing this from you, now I understand it. I've never really quite,
Hmm.
although somebody on this other Zoom laughed and said, yeah, well, we'll be getting rid of that soon. Like, uh, political aside. Uh, at any rate, but now if you're describing that, so it's really a house of people with no feeling, or with what maybe we would call heart.
Mm. Well, it could be. It also, I think, could be just sort of like a comment about how important it is to be thoughtful. You know what I mean? To have the ability to think.
Yeah.
At least that's how I've always interpreted it. Although I think, I think it could be that as well, like that, or that ability to have multiple ways of thinking and feeling and being.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
fascinating.
It's really interesting. Yeah. A couple of questions about either religion / spirit. One question, somebody said, how does spirituality fit in? And somebody else commented, religion and language, or spirituality and religion interface. What is known about the original religion expressed through language? Maybe, you could interpret that different ways, but before the missionaries came along, and now in recovering and reclaiming the language of what is known about the original native belief system in terms of spiritual belief systems. I guess that's how I might ask that.
I think this would relate sort of to that conversation we were just having about having the land be part of people, and vice versa. There's a grammatical marker in Wampanoag that is what it's how you know that something kind of holds that same designation, right? Of being like one and the same. And it's an M, it's the sound at the end of something. And it is, you put it on nouns when they're, when you're using possession. But not all nouns have this. So land is one that has it. Anything having to do with water has it. Anything, actually, other things having to do with land. Like you could talk about like your rake, right? Something you use to keep your land healthy. All of those things would have it. And there's other categories of things as well. But I think those land and water are two examples that, so, if I want to say my river, my pond, my water, whatever, just like my land, you wouldn't just say, so I'll say it in English just so you can kind of understand. So you don't just say like my river, you would say my river, right? And that's what makes it like inalienable is what we call it. So you can't separate it from yourself, like it's part of you. And I think that that like that kind of thing throughout the language, like that's one example of how we come to understand, like, I feel like in a lot of native traditions, like there's this idea that, it's almost like become a little bit of a cliche, like, like the native person who's, just completely in tune with the land. And, it's almost like a caricature now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's not like, it's not a character, like that's actually real, Mm-hmm. So there is an actual like understanding in Native communities that like we're not like it's not about like, oh, respect the trees because we have to get oxygen from them. Like these are our brothers and sisters. Like this is, and actually one of the creation stories that was, and actually this is the part of this movie that I'm in, if you watched it, the part where I'm talking about the story of the pine trees, right? And that those are our ancestors. Those are the first Wampanoag people. So like we are the same. It's not really, it's literal. Like we are the same. They are us, we are them. And so I think those are things that have been uncovered through the language in a more explicit way, although they weren't necessarily unknown. Maybe just the stories like the specific stories were unknown.
Mhm. That makes sense. Thank you. Okay, just a quick question. The film talked about Jessie's daughter, May, being the first native speaker in 100 years. Are there others now?
There are, as I mentioned, so we have about 30 students who are pretty good Wampanoag language speakers in our school. I don't know if we have any other children who are like fluent first language speakers, because I have to admit that I am not as good about using Wampanoag at my house as I should be. And for our other fluent or nearly fluent adults with children who could sort of be potentially able to pull that off at home, I don't know that any of us have first language children at home. But of, let's say the 15 or so children among the most fluent speakers at this time, the oldest of those kids probably are a good bit younger than May. May is 16 now. So I would say probably a lot of the kids that are growing up with language in the home are like 0 to 8 or 0 to 10 maybe.
A lot of questions about May. Can you update us on May and her language interest now? Still speaking.
Not much of her in a while, actually. Yeah, I don't see her too much, but yeah, she's 16. She I think, goes to high school on the island.
Okay. Okay, I think there are a lot. There've been lots of comments and lots of appreciation. So I feel like we should let you guys go, but I can't thank you enough for the film, for sharing it, and really to the two of you for sharing the time and being willing to talk to us. Obviously, it means a lot and it helps a lot because it's a really rich film, and to be able to talk to the two of you, gives it much greater depth. So deeply, deeply appreciated your time and the film.
Well, it means a lot to me that you saw in it something for your mission. That means a lot to me.
My gosh, absolutely. I mean, I just think there's so much resonance with everything going on in this country right now, and around the world. I just feel like there's a lot to learn there. And so it's really been an honor to be able to show it and have you guys here with us and talk to us about it. And we will be sending more information about your work, Nitana, with WLRP around for people who are interested in supporting and learning more about it. So we're going to send that around. And before we sign off, I just want to quickly tell people that the next event in our series is actually next week on December 2nd. We're having a talk by Dr. Ron Welburn called, the title is Living the Survivance in the Algonquin Landscape. And Ron Welburn is an emeritus professor in the English department at UMass Amherst, where he served as the director of the department's American Studies graduate concentration and a co-founder of the university's certificate program in Native American Indian Studies. And he's going to talk from his personal experience and life learning as someone of Indigenous heritage, and hopes to illuminate Native ways of survival and survivance as dynamic in spite of historical and modern pressures in making an impact on cultural identity. So I hope that many of you will be able to join us on December 2nd for that. So I just want to thank you on behalf of Karuna and on all of us who were just honored and thrilled to be able to watch the film and to be able to talk with the two of you. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great to see you, Nitana.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.